Hello, welcome everybody to our panel on AR, VR, and education. You guys are in for a treat. We have an awesome panel of people that are working on AR and VR in all sorts of different ways. So we want to get straight into it. So I'm just going to do really quick introductions, and then we're going to start talking about mostly some of our challenges of making AR and VR happen in education. I think that will be very interesting. So we have Heather Shen to my left here. She works for Praxis Labs, and she'll tell a little bit about what she does with the AI training. Then Anson works for Microsoft. Aditya
Vishwanath.
He works. I did practice his last name, but I still got it wrong. So he actually has done some great PhD work. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and also some, and then in Inspirit, and then lastly Sam, who is part of. He does. I forgot your name of the company. The gamification for doctors. So really cool stuff. So as I mentioned, we want to talk. We are all VR advocates, so we can talk about the great things about VR. So instead, to make it a little bit more interesting, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges. So Heather, why don't we start with you? Talk about your diversity training and what you do that's different. And what are some of the challenges when you bring this to corporations?
Sure, thank you. So I'm a co-founder of Praxis Labs. We're a learning and development company that's focused on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI work. We leverage immersive learning and virtual reality to enable people to be in different perspectives, either as someone experiencing bias or someone who's complicit in the incident, to really think about how do they practice responding in that moment. We pair that with an online learning and reflection platform that guides people through a reflection of what they just went through, serves up context, terms, and definitions of what they just experienced so they can tie it back to their real life and workplaces, and then ask them to apply what they learned in real life. So we do a really intentional VR learning journey that leverages multiple modalities and deploys over different ways so that we can meet workforces and corporations where they're at.
Very cool. So Sam, I'm going to go with you next.
Sure.
So I want you to talk to the audience. Is you do gamification for doctors, and then you also do VR. So talk about your challenges in gamification versus VR. Who adopts VR? Who adopts the gaming platform? Sure. So talk about your platform all across.
Sure thing. So I run a company called LevelX. We make video games for doctors. All right, what does that mean? It means we use video game design, basically the neuroscience behind video game design and video game technology, to accelerate the adoption of new techniques, new products, new skills in medicine. So we have a team of 130 people, some of the top game designers, artists, engineers who've worked on everything from Mortal Kombat to Words with Friends, and they're working with hundreds of physician advisors and contributors across basically every major specialty to capture the challenges of the practice of medicine using game mechanics. We say level X is like the Matrix. You can't be told what level X is. You have to see it for yourself because it's very visual. But I think I'm going to be doing some demos tomorrow morning, so we have a session then. So in terms of challenges, so we have 750,000 medical professionals playing our games on mobile, earning continuing medical education credit, CME credit, while they do surgery on rare and difficult cases or diagnose complex patients. There's all sorts of interesting puzzle and strategy games. We've also brought probably around 70,000 through mobile AR experiences that you can play on your phone using, the AR capabilities of the phone. And when it comes to headsets, we've probably bought around 7,000 medical professionals through our VR headset experiences, which is not bad, but you can sort of see the orders of magnitude as you start moving from, the device that everybody has in their pocket to the brick that everybody needs to strap onto their head. But over time, that's changing as these devices both get more ergonomic and more pervasive.
So Aditya, I want to take where Sam said. So I think it's kind of interesting that the gaming and then the VR headset, right? But the VR has some really cool things on the pedagogy, right? As far as what you're able to do. Does VR, if we can focus a little bit on your research, because you've done a lot of research on this. You have a PhD on the effective use of education technology, right? If I got it right?
Yeah.
So if you can talk a little bit about your research, I think we can all benefit from the research you've done on how is VR done right?
Yeah, and I do want to clarify, I'm actually finishing my PhD exactly on this topic. I mean, kind of to your point as well, a very interesting thing that we have learned about what makes VR work and what makes, when I say VR, it paints this picture of this piece of hardware on your head. A few things that we should keep in mind is that what that device looks like today is probably not what it's going to look like tomorrow. Where virtual reality as a piece of hardware is today is probably where the smartphone was maybe in the late 90s or the early 90s, where it was this bulky, big thing that would never fit in your pocket. And if someone ever told you that you would be able to carry this thing around for days on end without ever having to charge it, you would think that that was a bit of an impossible task. And so we have to keep in mind that the hardware is not there yet for what the vision for virtual reality is, which fundamentally is a medium of engagement and it's a new medium of communication, a new medium of learning. I work in the K-12 space, both through my research and my ongoing dissertation work at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and through the company that I co-founded, Inspirit. We spend a lot of time in the science and STEM education space working with children. And what we have learned is that a lot of the learning outcomes associated with spending time in these virtual learning environments has a lot to do with the degree of control you give the learner in these spaces. And so it's the degree of interactivity, the number of degrees of movement, mobility, freedom, and manipulation of the scene is what makes this work. And this is why traditionally, and there's a ton of research on this, why video games are so compelling, even when the CGI or the graphics really sucks. I mean, you could play Mario for days on end, but it's just a 16 by 16-bit game. And the reason why it works is because of the degree of control you have in manipulating the scenes and manipulating the cause and effect of what happens to Mario in these worlds. And so this is exactly why VR that was built for either 6 degrees of freedom, highly immersive headsets, which has like multiple controllers, lots of hand gestures, why they're so much more immersive than like something on the Google Cardboard headset, which is not very interactive. It's immersive, sure, but you're mostly just watching a 360 video. It's still a passive experience. And you'll see, we have seen engagement drops. I ran a study as well in the early days of my PhD working with the Google Expeditions platform. If anyone knows what that is, it was an education K-12 app. And huge, initial engagement, huge initial adoption, and then it completely drops in the long term because finally the conclusion was it's a novelty product. It really doesn't have any long-term effects. But the degree of control that you give the user, the more degree of control you give them has a direct relationship to the long-term sustainable engagement and retention associated with the content that you're learning. In general, it's a lot of ifs and buts here, and it's an evolving field. But that's kind of a huge kind of finding or observation that we have had.
Cool. So Anson, can you, so you work at Microsoft and you help educators basically adopt tools, right, into that.
For sure.
And, so based on this, that you need to have control, right, and that control kind of gives that, kind of makes the AR work. Can you talk about that, the different tools that you have in Microsoft and how AR makes it different, because you actually do have that interaction with the content that you're dealing with.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, just going back to one of your earlier questions around the main challenges of bringing AR and VR in education is really around the content, creating the right content that's needed to actually make an impact on student learning outcomes, right? But at the end of the day, if you're bringing an AR or VR headset onto a student and a student is not learning any better, is there really a purpose of doing that? And I think the answer is not really, right? Potentially, really understanding how do you provide students the right level of content for them to learn is the most difficult part. And actually, one of the biggest challenges is ensuring that we actually create the right content. So at Microsoft, we really focus on really creating the right platform for developers, for startups, to create the right content on our AR and VR platform. In addition, we have also created some first-party tools, almost like what I call like the Word or PowerPoint for the HoloLens or for AR. It really allows for anyone, regardless of their ability to develop on Unity, to create their own experiences. So for example, one of those applications is called Microsoft Dynamics 365 Guides, which is pretty much a PowerPoint-like experience on the PC, which will allow a student, an educator, a TA to drag and drop arrows and digital assets to create an experience for the HoloLens right away with no lines of code. And that really starts creating some of it. What Aditya talked about was some more engaging experiences that doesn't require 10, 15, 20, 30 hours of development time to create.
So Sam, so actually all three of you, because you guys are doing the content part, right? So you're working with corporations, you're working with K through 12. You know, Sam, you're working with doctors. So the content, I mean, you guys are on the content side. So I don't know if you want to, you know, respond to that, because there are already some really cool content things. So is it a content thing, or is the hardware still not where it needs to be? How is the hardware going to evolve? How does it need to evolve? You know, to catch up to the content, or is the content still having to catch up to the hardware? Sam, why don't you start with that question?
Oh my gosh! All right, you know what? Panels are more fun when people disagree, so I'm going to disagree. I think the whole idea that I disagree with the notion that the level of engagement correlates to the number of degrees of freedom you have on the hardware. I think that point was actually. I don't even need to make another example. The point was proven by Mario, right? Look at how engaging Mario is. How many degrees of freedom do you have? There's between 4 and 6 buttons, right? You play that game for hundreds of hours. We got VR headsets where you've got 2 6-degree of freedom controllers, and then each one of them has 5 buttons that you can use in any combination. And when you talk about like making a engaging, accessible game experience, what you're doing is creating all sorts of cognitive load that makes it very, very, very difficult for a new player to engage with that experience. I think if you look at healthcare, we've got, so to answer the question about whether it's content or hardware, it's content. And one of the things that we see in healthcare specifically when it comes to VR is lots of terrible content. There's lots of examples, again, talking about degrees of freedom, where like they have simulators where you have to like put on the headset and all the equipment, and it takes you 10 minutes just to figure out how to walk around the patient in the virtual operating room, as if that matters. Like, why do you need to learn how to use the device? There are lots of examples. So a big area in medicine for medical education is around things like mechanism of action, understanding how molecules and cells interact in these complex cascades to understand how a drug works. So historically, they've had these like almost Pixar quality animations to try to explain this to you, where you're flying around the molecules and the cells to see what's going on. And then there was a big push a few years ago, well, those aren't engaging enough, so we need to put them in VR. So what happens is we took a nice big video that 20 people could watch at once, we shoved people into an egg chair, put a VR headset on their head, and then flew them around a molecule, but they weren't physically moving. So if you've ever experienced seasickness, what causes it is when you see something moving, but your body isn't moving, and your vestibular system goes out of sync with your visual system, and it triggers nausea, which is exactly the opposite experience you want to trigger during an educational anything. So I think there's like it's not about the hardware. You can run it on something with low degrees of freedom, high degrees of freedom. It's all about really well-designed content that takes into account the way the human brain works and the way the human brain learns. End rant.
And I do want to add to that also and say one interesting way in which we think about why you should use a headset versus build something on 2D and build something on a video platform is, I think very often we have this hangover we bring from video to VR, where we're like, oh, here's this fancy new technology. How can we do video conferencing in this in a way in which is better? And all of these to me are still very incremental improvements at the cost of a lot of onboarding trouble and a lot of just support work that needs to be done to get acclimatized to this new environment. Like, sure, you can organize a video conference in virtual reality, but is that really so much more of an upgrade than you doing this on Zoom? A better question to ask is not how is VR better than video? A better question to ask is what can you do in VR that was just impossible before? And so I think like Heather's use cases are very interesting, like perspective taking, putting you in the shoes of somebody else and having you look at something from a different vantage point is something that was really not possible before with video, where you could really look at things from different angles and different perspectives. So I think an interesting question to ask is just fundamentally questioning, like, what does this new medium unlock that was not possible before? And if you believe that this could be done without VR, then don't use VR. Like, it's clunky, it's messy, VR, AR, whatever, it's messy, it's still an evolving piece of device and technology, and there's a lot of more efficient, effective, scalable ways to do it if you can answer that question with something that's not a headset.
And I think one of the areas that we haven't even touched on yet is the accessibility of VR, AR. So if you think about people who have different ability levels, who are perhaps neurodiverse, like, they will interact with VR and AR as a medium in so many different ways. And if we're thinking really about education and how do we leverage this medium, I think we have to think about there must be different ways that we can say this is immersive, but still safe for all those different learners.
So Anson, I'm curious about your response to that, right? Because there are also just on the, use case, even in education, right? There's some use cases that, they're no-brainers, right? That it is actually easier and more economical to have AR headsets than the additional tools that you would require to give that class. Could you talk a little bit about some of your experiences on that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I would really echo what Aditya said was really, the question is, what can you do in VR or AR that you cannot do in real life? And I think one of the classic examples that we talk about is with Case Western. With Case Western, they completely digitized a cadaver, a human body, into augmented reality. And they were able to place that 3D object in AR and allow for a full class of students to interact, dissect, and see things that are not possible in a physical human body, right? It allowed the student to take a human body home and continue to learn. With COVID, when schools had to shut down, every single student at home was able to continue to learn anatomy and take an exam from the comfort of their bedroom, their kitchen, and home. That's not possible with a cadaver lab, right? And with cadavers, they surprisingly cost a lot of money to maintain and keep inside a university. So there's a lot of things that you can do in AR and VR that's not possible in real life. And I think that's the most critical part when you talk about building content. It's not taking potentially what you can do on a 2D screen into VR, but it's really thinking of those critical use cases and scenarios that you can't do in real life into VR and AR.
Yeah, I think even about myself, I have a VR headset in my living room, right? And, I play games and do whatever on it every now and then, but a lot of times I just grab my phone, right? And, there's still some things that I can do on my phone and they're just easier to do. So let's talk about, the classroom scenario, right? Same thing. How do we make sure that, if we give these tools, even if we solve the hardware and the content, right? So that teachers kind of, go to the VR headsets, or how does the VR headset need to interact? And Aditya, since you're working on K through 12, talk a little bit about the existing tools, the existing LMS, the chalkboard. How do you incorporate your courses into the existing lesson plans?
Yeah, and I kind of want to start out with with saying that it is incredibly hard to bring any kind of technology into the classroom, into a formal, your average K-12 classroom. That is probably one of the most difficult spaces for you to introduce any technology. I mean, right now, after decades, is K-12 adopting video, because video conferencing, because of COVID, and it was mostly out of necessity. And you can imagine like many other industries adopted video conferencing a decade ago. And so generally there is a huge lag in time between when K-12 starts to bring emerging and new technologies at scale into the classroom. I think one of the most successful technological integrations in K-12 has been the Chromebook, and like really successfully done at scale when you bring all sorts of players onto the table, the curriculum developers, the policy makers, the funders, the technology folks, the educators. There's like an incredible amount of work that went into bringing that into the core kind of classroom management software and planning. I don't think headset VR, I don't think the way to go for K-12 is one-to-one student to headset, at least not in K-12. There are multiple use cases in higher ed where this might make sense. A lot of use cases in labs, in libraries, in all sorts of other informal, non-traditional learning environments, but in an environment where you have people sitting on a chair and somebody in the front writing on a whiteboard, it would be a complete nightmare for the teacher to have 30 students running around with headsets bumping into each other, and kind of just logistically, that just does not make sense to me today in the form factor and the function with which VR is and exists today. What is more interesting, though, is looking at the world of virtual learning and virtual learning environments. And so the way we think about that at both Inspirit and also in some of my research and this area of research is virtual learning environments have been around for a long time. That's what video games are. These are virtual environments and worlds. They're environments where you can learn, where you can essentially represent yourself in the form of, in some cases, an avatar or some other character or some sort of embodiment takes place, and then you go through a series of exercises, whether it's a mission, whether it's a quest, whether it's levels, whether it's a storyline or a narrative or a curriculum. And so I think it would be very interesting to find ways to bring virtual learning environments into K-12 curriculums, and that requires, again, a huge emphasis on content design, development, pedagogy, and understanding how they directly correlate to both the traditional outcomes like retention, test scores, as well as new outcomes as in outcomes that maybe were harder to tap into, like socio-emotional learning and building deeper confidence and self-efficacy towards subjects, which is one thing we have seen when a student actually, in science especially, when a student actually spends time in a virtual environment and learns Newton's laws of motion, for example, by throwing a ball and looking at where the ball lands, and then we let you change gravity, and now you're throwing a ball on the moon, and you're predicting whether it's going to land higher or closer, further or nearer. You're not just learning the equations and the formulas, but you're building that physical intuition of how the laws of motion work when you change gravity, which is something you obviously cannot do in the real world. And that leads to a deeper sense of confidence, self-efficacy towards the subject. And those are very interesting use cases that you can bring without needing everybody to be inside a headset. This can be done through gamified approaches. This can be done on the mobile phone today. And I would still put that in the realm of augmented and virtual reality, because that's just how that term has evolved today. I would not call it kind of the hardcore VR enthusiast in me would kind of hesitate to call that VR or virtual reality. But I would say that those are the baby steps we can take today to move towards fully immersive VR, if we need that. I mean, to me, I come from the world of education more than the world of VR, and I see this more as I don't want VR to be a hammer that's looking to beat nails down, but more importantly, like what are the fundamental challenges we're seeing in education? And a huge challenge right now in K-12 is retention, engagement, and huge dropout rates in STEM programs as it gets harder, especially among low-income, marginalized communities. And this might be a very powerful tool to build that self-efficacy, to build that confidence. And if so, then let's do it. Let's bring it. And if so, then there might be ways to integrate that in informal spaces like after-school environments, tutoring, libraries, labs. But in a traditional classroom with 35 students and a teacher, logistically it would be very hard. There are like technological and technical challenges before we even get to the use cases and the usage.
Sam, you?
Just two responses to that. So first, LevelX does not make content for K-12. We're focused on practicing doctors. But I have experimented. I did get a room full of classroom of second graders to do a virtual reality colonoscopy. Went over very well. I'm no longer invited to career day, though, because it's not fair to the other parents. But to the point, though, like the example of, teaching the physics of parabolic flight. I think this is actually a really good example of why it's not just a matter of recreating the reality or simulating things in a virtual environment in order to drive education. You actually, in order to get the best results, you need to use what we call real game design. The example I give, actually, the best example of teaching parabolic flight is Angry Birds. But think about how that game works, right? Have you ever wondered why Angry Birds is so addictive? Why, like, 10 years later, people are still playing it? It's evolutionary. So think back to the first time you played Angry Birds, what happened? You pull the bird into the slingshot, you fire it at the Tower of Pigs, and you miss. And all the pigs laugh at you, right? And you get frustrated. All of this is game design building up. Second bird hops in, you pull it back, you fire, you get closer to the Tower of Pigs, and you still miss. And you get more frustrated. And then the third bird hops in, you pull it back, you fire, and it's glorious. It's not just the simulation. There's explosions, animation, sound effects, the music changes. All of this is deliberately designed to trigger a dopamine release in your brain, which is what physically reinforces the neural pathways used on the last fire. This is how 2 hours later you're firing that bird between two narrow obstacles at 50 yards, and why 50 hours later you're still playing the game. This is not something we just made up in the games industry. This neuromechanic has existed in the mammalian neuron for tens of millions of years. This is precisely how our ancestors learned how to throw a spear. But the way you get this right is not just by creating a tower and a slingshot. You need to be adding all of these other elements into the experience, and this is what we call, in the exercise that is game design. All of this technology, at least in the games industry, when we use it successfully to engage audiences of hundreds of millions of people for hundreds of hours, it's the technology in service of that neuroscience-based design.
And I actually wonder if the difference between hard skills and soft skills training is that game design, because I think one of the things we're trying to be really mindful of is, Jedi issues are so, they're so innate to all of us. I think there's a danger in gamifying it too much, because so much of what we're trying to say is that it's not just in virtual reality, it's not just in that 10 minutes when you take on a new perspective or you go through a corporate learning. It's what do you do outside of that? How do you tie it to your everyday lives? How do you tie it to your everyday workplaces? That I think it becomes really powerful. Even in the classroom training, I think there's opportunity around what did you just learn, and how does that relate to what is going on around you and what you see around you, because you can only cover so much in an 8 to 10 minute simulation.
And you do that, right? And part of your program, two things that I like about your program is it's a program. It's not just one class. It's a long program, and then you also have the reflection part, right? That you use tools outside of VR to actually make what you see in VR powerful, right? So can you talk about that, about how your reflection, and the follow-up of the subject, how does that work with your program?
Yeah. I think we're so intentional about creating learning journeys, and it's really a curriculum of, every month you do a 30-minute learning session where that learning session combines VR or immersive learning. We do offer mobile apps as well as a web version of immersive experience. But then we also tie that with how you're seeing it in your workplace, how you're seeing it show up there, and ask you to think about what you can apply, what you've learned, so that you can create a more inclusive and equitable environment. And so it's that direct application after experiencing something and taking on a new perspective that makes it so much more powerful for people to actually want to take action afterwards.
Cool, thank you. Can we go back to your colonoscopy story?
Sure.
Because I have a question about that, and this goes for everybody, right? With these tools, with VR, and this actually has happened even before VR, right? Are we, democratizing content? Right now, we joked about, similar joke, right? That after watching some of his videos, I was ready to operate on my own knee, right? So are we through these experiences that are so real and so interactive? What is the role then of the institution, of the curriculum, if I can kind of teach myself these things? So, Sam, why don't you take this one and let's go.
Say video games and VR, I think this is part of the theme of what everyone's been saying, have their place in education, but they are by no means a panacea. So, if we sort of my dream, sort of Level X's vision of what we want, at least in medicine, is that video games take their place among other established means of education and training. So today I say, oh, we make video games for doctors. Everyone raises their eyebrow. 5 years from now, we say, oh, we make video games for doctors. And everyone's like, yeah, of course video games for doctors. Like, that's always been a thing. Just like there's, movies for, there's animation for doctors and lectures for doctors and there's video games. But the role that it plays is very specific. When you have any sort of complex system where you need in your brain to develop a mental model of what is going on, the best way to do that is to play with it. And that's where video games can really help. When it comes to rote memorization, when it comes to sort of like a lot of other things a lot of other kinds of learning that don't require these systemic understanding, it's not worth making the investment in games. So yeah, that's sort of like what we how we think about this going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I agree. I think that the tying it to that, the existing.
And we're not going to replace cadaver
We're not going to
labs.
replace, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, like as great as a VR experience you're going to make, or you still can't. I mean, orthopedic surgery is still carpentry. Like, there are forces of hundreds of newtons that you're dealing with that you can't simulate in VR. So you're always going to need to be doing, it's going to complement and replace some of it, but you're always going to need certain types of training.
Yeah. So
Yeah, for sure. And I want to echo that as well. With AR and VR, it's really about complementing. And I think that's another challenge that, going back to the earlier question, is ensuring that the AR and VR tools that we create and bring into the classroom actually fit into the ecosystem of a classroom, right? Understanding that how does this piece of curriculum or content fit into your curriculum, into your learning management system? How do you actually assign these assignments, grades to these experiences, and really ensuring that these experiences flow in the workflow of your classroom? So how do you distribute these assignments, these experiences? How does a student log into an AR VR device? How do they? How does an educator understand what a student did on a device? Right? There's many other ecosystem problems that need to be addressed before you can actually really scale with AR and VR in a K-12 or a higher education classroom.
So, but as far as complementing education, I think that's where we really focus on, right? We do make some lessons better, right? There are certain things that, we do help, VR helps in retention, in proficiency, and metrics that educators care about. So there's certainly some things that do, we certainly help, we complement it. So Anson, I'm going to go back to you because you and I kind of have a similar roles, right? We're trying to help the industry, adopt, or understand what the technology can do and what it needs to be to adopt. So how do we, get that message out there, or what needs to happen so that, schools and governments, become believers on what the power of VR and AR can really do, right? That we have experience and that we know about. I think you see a lot of companies and you see a lot of help a lot of institutions, right? So tell me from your perspective, what needs to happen?
Yeah, I think there's two main things. The first one, like we talked about earlier, is really finding the core use case that actually makes a difference inside a classroom. And those core use cases need to come with a pedagogical rationale, understanding how this tool makes an impact on a student in the classroom. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is really around doing roadshows and seeing is believing. With AR and VR, you can watch a video of someone doing an AR VR experience, or you can watch a student doing an AR VR experience. But until you actually put the decision maker in the experience, they don't really understand the impact that AR and VR has in a classroom. So I think those are two main things. And the second one is actually pretty difficult, I think, right? Because AR and VR is a one-to-one experience, and you can't really do road shows with 1,000 people in a day, right?
But there's a collaborative part to it as well, right? And I think we all know that when you have, the experience of having a VR experience when you're actually interfacing with someone else, that actually makes it that much more powerful. So Aditya, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that as well. I don't know if in your research you found out about that co-learning experience, and it's one of the key pedagogies, just even in traditional pedagogy, right? When you have that interaction between students. So how does AR, maybe VR not so much, or maybe it's beginning to, but then how does AR go there as well?
Yeah, and I want to start out kind of going back to the point I made at the very beginning. We still are coming to these new technologies with that hangover of being with the old technologies, which our use cases are extremely narrow even today, and we're just scratching the surface of what one can do with these two technologies, AR and VR, and whatever happens to them as they evolve. And there's like talks about how they might blend into some middle thing, whatever. But like there's like a ton of opportunity here that we aren't even exploring because we're still thinking of incremental improvements and upgrades. I mean, collaborative, social experiences that really are kind of truly embodying what some of these pedagogical theories were, like constructionism, constructivism, like the ability to co-construct and build experiences or projects or activities together was only possible if two people were physically located in the same room with access to resources in that same physical space. Now, that works if you are working with your friend and making a Lego project, but when you scale that up to enterprise use cases where you have extremely expensive equipment, people working in global teams around the world, there is massive opportunity to use technologies like AR and VR for just problem solving together, for collaborative, constructive development and growth. And so, I still think we're just scratching the surface of what one can do with these technologies. But for this to truly work, you have to find ways to make this accessible at every level. So on the hardware level, costs will go down. There are players out there that are fighting it out to bring the costs down. There are innovations happening in battery technology, which is very critical to the success of AR and VR in the long term, because, I mean, like the HoloLens and the Magic Leap devices still have a big battery pack that you have to carry with you. And if you just look at what it was 6 years ago and what it is today, it has shrunk in size almost 3 or 4 times. But we still have some way to go. So there are lots of other innovations that need to be happening for this to truly work. At the software level, there are some amazing software platforms now, mostly game engines like Unity and Unreal, that allow high accessibility and high entry for indie creators and people who don't require significant technical knowledge to build their own games in a completely hardware agnostic manner. You can build ones, deploy across mobile, VR, AR, desktop, and that was not possible 5 years ago as well. So it's definitely improving in access, definitely bringing down costs. The third thing that I think we need to think about is curriculum design, pedagogy, kind of design in different facets. Extremely important to think of the context in which VR or AR is being used and bringing those stakeholders as key decision makers. We made this mistake with other technologies in the past, where it was typically the tech deterministic people who would come into the classroom, to the learning environment and be like, here, take it. And it's of course going to make your lives better, whether it was the internet, whether it was laptops. I mean, this happened everywhere. It happens in an international context all the time. And we have to be very cognizant of really keeping the teacher, the learner, on the table when the discussion is happening for integrating and building tools or solutions for these technologies. Because curriculum design and pedagogy is what is going to sustain in the long term when the novelty wears out.
Speaking of the long-term effect, so what is the panel's belief, right? Because again, there's VR has this short-term wow effect, right? The first time you wear, you kind of are really impressed with what you see and what have you. But and there's a lot of talk about the retention of through VR. But is what we're seeing in VR really have a longer-term retention? Is there a transfer, of the knowledge that you gain in VR into the real world, right? And you have some real-world applications on that. And then also going back to the collaboration thing, I also wanted you to talk a little bit about that, Sam. That you actually do with medical devices. You do some collaboration work, And again, going back to your point that you're doing things that couldn't be done before. So can you talk a little bit about, I kind of combined 3 points in there, but...
Combined 3 in 1 minute and 30 seconds. I mean, I think the endless studies continue to show that knowledge, and we know this based on how the brain works, the knowledge is transferable, right? It's transference. You're able to, a decision that you make on a phone or in a VR headset or exploring, making the wrong decision, making the right decision, you're able to trigger an emotional response. If you're able to trigger that emotional response, you're able to effectively remember that experience as if you did it in person. There's lots of studies, both in education and entertainment, that have demonstrated this to be the case. And there are, behind this is an entire discipline of game design that is built around these ideas, and how do you effectively take advantage of the way the brain works and the way the brain has evolved to learn, and the way the brain has evolved to engage, in order to create play environments and experiences that maximize engagement, maximize learning.
Great. Well, we're 30 seconds in, so I want to really thank the panelists, and this is a great discussion. I mean, we can go on, talk about all these different aspects. So please, applause for these guys, not for being in the panel, but for the great stuff that they're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.